As someone who drives a lot at night, speeding down abandoned highways with little more than the streetlights for company, I've always made it my policy not to pick up hitchhikers. For me, the reward of doing some stranger a favor is not worth the risk that they might turn out to be some knife-wielding psycho. If you don't pick them up, they don't have the chance to kill you, or so you'd think. But what happens when you find that there is a hitchhiker in your car, sitting in the back seat and grinning maliciously at you in the rear-view mirror when you didn't pick anyone up? I know it sounds crazy, but that is exactly what happened to me one night last summer. I was heading back from my girlfriend's house. I work in a different area and needed to be back home to make it into the office on time the next day for a big meeting, so I left her place quite late and was doing a pretty good speed down the deserted highway on the way back to mine. The road was completely clear, the fields that stretched out either side like an empty wall of black, and save for the orange glow of the street lamps, the only was my headlights. Coming to a particular section of the journey, I slowed slightly, because I knew that this portion of the road didn't have lights at all, even though it was a straight road. The idea of bombing it along with no actual lights on the road, guided only by my headlights and the cat's eyes down the center, always seemed a little dangerous, so I took my foot off the gas a little and eased up on the speed. As I entered the darker section, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the side of the road and holding a flimsy cardboard sign. Despite the light drizzle, they were wearing only a black vest, what looked like a long skirt, and for some unknown reason, a large black top hat that made them look like a corny old stage magician. I remember thinking how stupid it was of this individual to hitchhike right near the section without lights, not only because it made them harder to see and so less likely to be picked up, but also because this was a more dangerous section of road, and if a driver made a mistake and veered into the hard shoulder, then they would end up a skid mark in no time. I reflected on this as I zoomed past, and without really thinking, looked up to my rear view to see if I could catch a glimpse of the person as they disappeared into the distance. What I saw instead was someone far closer, someone in the back seat. Seeing this figure, top hat on their head and face hidden in shadow sitting only a few inches behind me, made me almost have a heart attack, and it was all I could do to keep control of the vehicle, which I actually swerved in and out of the opposite lane as I turned the wheel in shock. Had this been daytime, when the highway was full and there would have been cars coming the other way, that would have been the end of me. Luckily, the other lane was completely empty, not to mention that I suspect my passenger did not travel by daylight very often. As I continued to drive, I fixed my eyes on the road, glancing up every few seconds to the shadowed outline sitting in the back seat. In the rear-view mirror, I could make out the hat, the slope of the shoulders, and a mass of curly black hair. I could not tell from this outline if the figure was male or female, and had no clue how they had gotten into the back seat of my car, nor could I see the face. All I could make out was the downward triangle of pointed chin and a large, toothy grin that spread across the face and seemed to be a fixed expression. Had this person broken into the car whilst I was at my girlfriend's? Had they been on the back seat all that time? If so, then was it just a coincidence that they too were wearing a top hat just like the person at the side of the road? Or had that hitchhiker, despite me never stopping, somehow found their way into the back of my car? I never spoke to the person in the back seat, and they never spoke to me, but I did resolve that whoever or whatever was sitting there, I did not want to take it home. So instead, I drove in silence through the entire 2 miles, without streetlights, feeling the breath of another on the back of my neck, and glancing every few seconds up to the mirror and to that awful toothy grin. Eventually, I reached the next section of the journey, a stretch that this time had streetlights, a section I decided that I could walk. Rolling the car slowly over to the hard shoulder, I unclipped my seatbelt, and as the vehicle rolled to a standstill, I opened the driver's side door, leapt out onto the hard shoulder, and ran, leaving the car, door open and abandoned, there by the side of the road. The next morning, me and a friend drove out to that same spot and picked up the car. It was exactly where I left it, the driver's side door still open, parked up on the hard shoulder. Even as I approached, I could tell there was nobody inside, and whoever had been there had gone. At first, my friend laughed, suggesting that I had imagined it, or had perhaps nodded off at the wheel and dreamt the whole thing. For a second, I suspected he might be right, until I saw the scrap of cardboard resting on the back seat. It was the same one the hitchhiker had been holding. Written across it was a word I did not recognize and which, at first, I thought was a name, Nusquam. I later found out that the word is Latin. It means nowhere. When people used to ask me, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" my answer used to be a categorical no. Nowadays that has changed. I still wouldn't say yes, because even if what I experienced was a ghost or some kind of spirit, I didn't really see it. Now when people ask the question, have you ever seen a ghost? I say I hope so, because as far as I'm concerned, the alternative is far, far worse. Working as I do for an international finance company, it's often the case that I have to work what some people call antisocial hours. The reason is that whilst markets might be open and colleagues awake where I am, there are often deals that involve companies, colleagues and clients from other countries that work on a completely different timescale. If I want to speak to a client in Hong Kong or discuss details after the markets open in Taiwan, that means that I have to be awake and online at the time. The result is that my sleep pattern is completely screwed up, and that often several times a week, I find myself driving home in what some would call the middle of the night, but what is really the early hours of the morning. In some ways, though it's a bit lonely, driving through the city at 4 a.m. is quite a cool experience. It's like the whole world, the world that you know well during the daytime, has been put on pause. Places that are usually bustling with people are completely empty. The streets are completely clear, and save for the odd garbage collection or stray dog, there isn't another soul around. Often I would drive the entire route from the office to my apartment, a journey that took me 3 times the duration when I did it in reverse during rush hour, without seeing a single other car on the road. That's partly why seeing the hearse was such a massive shock, especially when I realized that the chamber at the back of the vehicle was occupied. I first noticed the long black funeral car pulling out of a side road in my rearview mirror and instantly took notice. It was already weird to see another vehicle driving around at that time of the morning, so to see a funeral car that you wouldn't think would have any business at that hour was doubly weird. The car was highly polished, spotlessly clean, and of a slick oily black that seemed at some points, when I saw it just from the corner of my eye, like it had merged into the night it was driving through. Eventually I came to a traffic light, and despite the fact that I probably could have run the red light without any fear of hitting another vehicle or pedestrian, I obeyed the rules, as I always do, and rolled to a cushioned stop as the light switched to red. The hearse pulled up beside me. Actually, to say it pulled up besides is a little inaccurate. The front part of the vehicle, the section where the driver should have been, did not pull up next to me, but much further forward, over the line and partially into the junction. What actually pulled up beside me, to my left and just at eye level, was the back portion of the car and its occupant. Parallel to my driver's seat window, a dark mahogany casket cruised into view. There was a large wreath of green leaves and red and white flowers resting on the top. I remember looking at the casket and wondering where the hearse could be off at this time of night. No funerals took place at this time. Perhaps, I thought, they are just transporting the empty casket from one location to another, but if that were the case, then why would there be a wreath on top? I then wondered if maybe the casket was occupied, but that the occupant needed to be moved to another location in preparation for the funeral the next day. I had heard from Irish friends that sometimes a casket would be laid out in the front room of the family home the day before a funeral. As I was considering these possibilities and waiting for the lights to change, something extraordinary happened. There came a loud knocking from inside the casket. At first it was just the sound of a fist on wood, accompanied by a shuffling bump, as if someone shifting or moving inside. Then the knocks became louder and more frantic, as whoever was inside the casket panicked and beat desperately against the lid, screaming in a voice muffled by the thick fiberglass casing for someone to, "Help! Help me! It's not my time! It's not my time!" Obviously, I nearly jumped out of my skin and stared at the casket, for a moment wondering whether I had imagined the sounds. Perhaps I had nodded off, and my tired brain had dreamed the noises, but as I watched and the sounds continued, growing louder with each second, I saw the wreath placed on the lid jump and twitch up and down as someone beat and drummed on the underside of the lid. Opening the door and stepping out of my car, I intended to run up to the driver's window, to run up and tell them that they had made a mistake, that they were carrying someone who was very much alive, and that they needed to open up the casket. As I stepped out, however, the lights changed, and in contrast to the slow pace it had taken earlier, the hearse sped away with a wailing screech of its tires. I tried to take the license plate, but saw that the car didn't have one. Perhaps now you see why I would prefer to think this was a ghost, someone reluctant to accept that their time had come and who was clinging to this world. For me, that option is far more comforting than the thought of someone still alive clawing at the fabric of the still-sealed casket, running out of air in the hours before. They are doomed to be buried or cremated alive.